The coffee was still hot when my son called to tell me he'd been arrested. I remember the exact moment standing in my kitchen in Bozeman, Montana, watching the first light hit the Bridger Mountains through the window. The way it always did at 6:47 the morning. 41 years I'd watched that same light. 41 years in the same house, same kitchen, same coffee in the same ceramic mug my late wife Patricia had picked out at a craft fair in 1987. People in town knew me as the retired geography teacher who kept his gutters clean and waved at his neighbors. The man who brought casseroles to sick people and showed up early to shovel the church parking lot after a snowstorm. That was the man they saw. My son's voice on the phone was shaking in a way I hadn't heard since he was 9 years old and broke his arm falling out of the oak tree in our backyard. "Dad," he said, "they're saying I embezzled from the company." "Dad, I didn't. I swear to God I didn't do this." His name is Daniel. He's 43 years old, an architect, the kind of man who coaches Little League on Saturdays and remembers every one of his employees' birthdays. He built the pediatric wing at St. Vincent's Hospital in Billings. He is, without question, the finest thing I have ever had a hand in making. I told him to stop talking on that phone. I told him I was coming. I put down my coffee, went to the bedroom, and opened the closet. Behind the hanging shirts and the box of old tax returns, there's a gray duffel bag I packed 22 years ago and have repacked every year since. Old habit. In my previous life, the one I don't discuss at dinner parties, you never let the bag get stale. I was on the road within 40 minutes. Daniel had started his firm, Mercer Architecture and Design, 12 years ago, with a man named Craig Holloway. They'd met in graduate school at University of Michigan, been close friends ever since. Craig was the business side. Contracts, invoices, client relations, Daniel designed. It was one of those partnerships that seemed built to last, because each man trusted the other completely in his own lane. Daniel never looked at the books. He said Craig handled that side of things perfectly, and there was no reason to micromanage a friend. That trust, I had always quietly noted, was the only thing about my son that worried me. The charges were specific. $340,000 funneled from client accounts into a shell company over 18 months, all of it traced through authorizations that bore Daniel's digital signature. The DA's office had moved fast. Someone had handed them a clean, organized case. Too clean, too organized. I sat in the parking lot of the Yellowstone County Detention Facility for 20 minutes before I went inside. I needed to think without moving. This is something I learned a long time ago. Stillness is not the same as inaction. Some of my most important work happened while I was sitting completely still. What I knew: Craig controlled the accounts. Craig had access to Daniel's credentials. Craig had been the one to bring in their largest client 18 months ago, a real estate developer named Philip Stout, whose projects Daniel had designed but whose contracts had all been negotiated privately between Craig and Stout's company. What I suspected: this was not spontaneous. Someone had been planning this for a long time. What I needed: proof that could be handed to someone who would know what to do with it. I went inside and saw my son through the glass partition, and I kept my face completely neutral, because that is what he needed from me in that moment. Not grief, not rage. He needed to see that someone was already working. "Dad," he said, "my lawyer says the evidence is—" "Your lawyer's going to do his job," I said. "I need you to do something for me. I need you to write down every client project that Craig brought in personally over the last 2 years. Every one. Names, dates, approximate contract values. Can you do that?" He looked at me for a moment. Then something in his face settled. He'd seen that expression on me before, though it had been a very long time. "Okay," he said. I drove to Craig Holloway's office building on the west side of Billings. I didn't go inside. I sat in the parking lot for 2 hours with a cup of gas station coffee and a notebook, watching who came and went and at what times and in what order. People reveal enormous amounts of information through routine. The security guard took his smoke break at 10:15 and again at 12:40. The receptionist left for lunch at 12:05 and returned at 12:58. Craig's black Audi was in the same spot all morning. At 1:17, a man I didn't recognize came out of the building with Craig. They stood near a silver Ford pickup for 11 minutes. The unknown man did most of the talking. Craig nodded 4 times and shook his head twice. Before they parted, the unknown man handed Craig a manila envelope. I got a clear photograph of the man, his license plate and the time. Back at the motel I'd checked into on the north side of town, I opened my laptop and connected through a VPN I've maintained for 18 years, the subscription paid through a method that doesn't attach to my name. I ran the plate. The silver pickup was registered to a company called Stout Property Holdings, LLC. Philip Stout. I called a woman named Evelyn, who I worked with a very long time ago in a capacity neither of us discusses openly. She now runs a small forensic accounting practice in Denver. I told her I was going to send her some documents, and I needed to know if the numbers had been touched. "How long do I have?" she asked. "His arraignment is in 9 days, I said. She was quiet for a moment. "Send them tonight." Getting the documents required me to do something that is technically not legal. I want to be clear-eyed about that. I did it anyway. And I would do it again. And I'll leave the moral accounting to someone with more leisure time. What I can say is that I was careful, I was precise, I left nothing behind, and I was finished in under 4 minutes. What I sent Evelyn were 3 years of Mercer Architecture's internal financial records. The actual records, not the versions that had been submitted to the DA. I had a feeling those 2 sets of documents were not going to match. I was right. While I waited for Evelyn to work, I focused on Craig. Every man who does something like this tells someone. That's not a guess. That's 30 years of pattern recognition. The secret is too large and too satisfying to carry completely alone. They tell a girlfriend. They tell a brother. They tell someone over drinks when they're feeling invincible. The telling is part of why they do it. Craig was divorced, no siblings in the area. His social life, based on what I could reconstruct from public records and observation, revolved around a group of men he played golf with on Thursday mornings, and a woman named Sandra Okafor, who worked in commercial real estate and whose car had been parked outside his condo 3 nights running when I drove past at various hours. I needed to know how long Sandra and Craig had been seeing each other. The answer, which I found through a combination of his public social media and a conversation I had with a remarkably talkative bartender at a place called the River Rock Grill, was 14 months. 14 months. 2 months before the embezzlement began. I sat with that for a while. Sandra Okafor worked at a commercial real estate brokerage. Philip Stout was a real estate developer. I pulled Sandra's professional history from LinkedIn and from the State Real Estate Commission's public license records. She had worked at 2 previous brokerages over the past 6 years. The second one, where she'd spent 3 years before her current position, had Philip Stout as a listed client. I now had a triangle. I needed to find out which side of it was the foundation. I called Daniel's lawyer, a man named Garrett who was competent but who I privately assessed as not quite fast enough for what this situation required. I told him I was going to send him some things in the next few days, and that when I did, he should move immediately to request a full independent audit of the firm's accounts. I told him to make sure the request was on record before anything else happened. "Who are you?" he asked, which was a fair question from someone who'd just received instructions from a retired geography teacher in Montana. "I'm Daniel's father," I said. "That's all you need." On day 4, Evelyn called. "The originals were altered," she said. "The authorizations your son supposedly made the metadata on those files was modified after the fact. Someone created the appearance of his involvement retroactively." She paused. "This was done by someone who knew accounting software well enough to be dangerous but not well enough to be careful. I asked her to prepare a written report and to send 1 copy to me and 1 copy directly to Garrett. Then I drove to a coffee shop I knew Craig frequented on Tuesday afternoons. I had established his Tuesday routine 2 days prior. I chose a corner table with sightlines to the door and ordered a black coffee, and I waited. He came in at 2:40, ordered his usual, and sat down with his phone. He looked relaxed. That bothered me. The way injustice being carried off smoothly always bothers me. I walked over and sat down across from him. He looked up, and I watched his face go through 3 distinct expressions in about 1 second. Surprise, recognition, and then something that worked hard to become casual. Frank, he said. I didn't know you were in town. Craig, I said. I set my coffee on the table. I want to ask you something, and I'd like you to think carefully before you answer. He said nothing. He was assessing me. That was smart. How long have you known Philip Stout? I asked. A muscle in his jaw moved. Philip is a client. You know that. He's also Sandra's former client, I said. From her time at Meridian Property Group. I imagine that's how she introduced you. I'm curious whether that introduction happened before or after you started thinking about the accounts. He put his phone face down on the table. I don't know what you think I don't think anything, I said. Evelyn Marsh in Denver has already prepared a report. Garrett has a copy. The metadata on those authorization files is going to be the centerpiece of Daniel's defense, and the trail between Sandra, Stout, and your firm's invoicing structure is going to be the centerpiece of a separate investigation. I picked up my coffee. I'm not here to negotiate with you, Craig. I'm here because Daniel considered you a brother for 15 years, and I thought you deserved to hear from his father, that we know exactly what you did and why you did it. He stared at me. You were a geography teacher, he said finally. The contempt in his voice was only about half genuine. The other half was something else. I was, I said. Before that, he asked. I stood up. Before that is not your concern. I left him sitting there with his coffee going cold and whatever was happening behind his eyes happening very fast. 3 days later, Craig Holloway retained a criminal defense attorney. The following morning, that attorney contacted Garrett's office and requested a meeting to discuss what his client might offer in the way of cooperation. Garrett called me immediately. I could hear in his voice that he was recalibrating something about how he'd understood this situation. Whatever you did, he said, it worked. I had a conversation, I said. The cooperation Craig offered was this. Philip Stout had come to him through Sandra with a proposal 18 months ago. Stout needed a business to run fraudulent invoices through a legitimate, well-regarded firm that would provide cover for inflated project costs, with the excess routed back to Stout through a series of holding companies. Craig would receive a flat payment and a percentage. Sandra would receive a finder's fee. Daniel would receive, if the plan held, a felony conviction and a destroyed reputation. Leaving Craig as the sole principal of a firm Stout would then quietly absorb through a distressed acquisition. It was not a spontaneous act of greed. It was a structured takedown. Stout had done it before. Garrett's investigator found 2 prior instances, one in Colorado, one in Oregon, where business partners of a Stout-connected real estate venture had been removed through fraud allegations that later turned out to be manufactured. Both men had settlements. Neither had pushed further. Stout had learned from those cases what worked and what needed to be cleaner. He had not accounted for Daniel having the kind of father Daniel has. The DA's office dropped all charges against my son 11 days after his arrest. The case against Philip Stout, Craig Holloway, and Sandra Okafor was filed 4 days after that. The charges included wire fraud, conspiracy, and obstruction of justice. Stout's attorneys immediately filed motions that went nowhere. Craig pleaded guilty and received 7 years. Sandra received 4 years and a permanent revocation of her real estate license. Stout went to trial, and the jury deliberated for less than 6 hours. He received 18 years. I drove back to Bozeman on a Wednesday. The light was doing something beautiful to the mountains, and the radio was playing something I didn't recognize but liked anyway. I stopped at the diner on the edge of town and had the biscuits and gravy I'd been thinking about since day 2 of this, and I left a 20% tip because the waitress refilled my coffee without being asked, which is a quality I admire in a person. That evening, Daniel drove up from Billings. He brought his daughter, my granddaughter Claire, who is 7 years old and deeply serious about everything, which is the quality I love most about her. She sat at my kitchen table and worked on a drawing while Daniel and I had a beer on the back porch and watched the last of the light leave the mountains. He didn't ask me directly. He knows enough not to ask me directly. But after a while, he said, "Garrett told me you handed him everything in under 2 weeks. He said in 30 years of practice he'd never seen anything like it. Garrett is a capable attorney." I said, He knew what to do with the material. Daniel was quiet for a moment. Dad, who were you? Before teaching, I looked at the mountains. I thought about Patricia, who had known the answer and had kept it with the same loyalty and grace. She kept everything. I thought about 30 years of work I had done in the belief that precision and patience, applied in the right direction, could hold back a certain amount of darkness from the people who didn't know it was being held back. I was someone who learned how the bad ones think, I said. So I'd know where to look. He nodded. He didn't push. That's one of the things I did right. Raising him, he knows when a question has been answered as fully as it's going to be. We finished our beers. Claire came out onto the porch with her drawing, which turned out to be a picture of the three of us standing in front of the mountains, rendered in crayon with the specific, confident inaccuracy of a 7-year-old who has no doubt her version is correct. She handed it to me. That's you in the middle, she said. Because you're the tallest. I'm not, actually. Daniel has 3 inches on me. But I looked at that picture, the 3 figures, the mountains, the yellow crayon sun in the corner that children always put in the corner, and I thought that in all the ways that actually mattered, she might have gotten it exactly right. I put it on the refrigerator with a magnet that had been there since 1994. Some of the things I did over those 11 days, I cannot account for in polite company. Some of the skills I used were built in places and times I have made a quiet peace with. I am not a perfect man. I have made decisions I would not explain to a jury, but I know the difference between a weapon and a tool, and I know when one becomes the other. And I have spent my whole life being precise about that line. My son is free. The men who built that trap are in federal custody. My granddaughter drew me tallest. I have been retired for 16 years. I am very good at it.